Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the Egyptian election
قرر القضاء الإداري وقف الانتخابات
and the new rules for the media that are working for the government, not for the opposition. George W. Bush, Tony Blair, their versions of history.
Those decisions I made were necessary.
And the talking heads who helped them spin it. There is no diplomatic immunity from the uncensored truth, not when Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are involved. And animating to the beat in Germany in our web video of the week. We'll get to the WikiLeaks release in just a few minutes, but first, a major media story from one of the most important countries in the Arab world. The results of the first round of Egypt's parliamentary elections are now in, with the Muslim Brotherhood, which was the largest opposition group in the last parliament, failing to win a single seat. The allegations are flying over electoral fraud. We're focusing on the media side of this election, and the campaign gave us plenty of that. The government came up with an array of new restrictions on the media. They affected satellite broadcasting, religious programs, live political broadcasts. There were even new rules for text messaging, which has become so important to political organizers. Our starting point this week is Cairo and the muzzling of the media in Hosni Mubarak's Egypt.
شفافية الانتخابات البرلمانية التي تعقد في مصر.
The government is very clever in how it uses its authority to shut down media.
This month's parliamentary and next year's presidential polls.
It is much worse than we in the human rights groups in Egypt have expected.
Really, it's an exercise in vote rigging, fraud, intimidation, and violence.
Dissidents and the opposition are finding other ways to reach out to the people.
سيطرت عليها في الانتخابات السابقة.
Egypt's media space, once among the most vibrant in the Middle East, is now a pale shadow of its former self. A big part of that change occurred over the past 2 months.
Since the beginning of October, there was a massive attack to restrict the freedoms of the media, creating an environment of fear. So there is no hot debate at all because everyone is doing his or her best to avoid facing problems like what happened with others.
The others in this case include 12 religious TV channels shut down early in the campaign. The government said they incited hatred. Then the private production companies many broadcasters use for live political shows had their licenses revoked and were told to apply for new ones mid-campaign. There was a similar new licensing requirement for text message providers. The Mubarak government used bureaucracy, new regulations, to silence the sound of the Egyptian street.
You never hear the Egyptian government coming out and saying we are shutting down a specific channel because of the content of its programs. What they describe most of the time are licensing issues, that these channels did not have the proper permits. They find legal nuances to shut down a lot of these channels.
So the message, it was received by all media players. I mean the owners of the TV, other TV channels, the moderators of the talk shows, the producers on programs, whatever religious or not religious, and everyone has become very worried.
Worried journalists tend to censor themselves. Owners take steps too. Ibrahim Issa is one of the country's best-known columnists and one of the Mubarak regime's toughest critics. At least he was until he was fired by the new owners of his newspaper, Dustour.
Well, Ibrahim Issa may no longer be on television or the editor of Dustour in print, but he's definitely online. He's still writing, and the website is still very active. Increasingly, people are turning to alternate sources, and so there are other options. I mean, all is not lost in that respect.
Here is really where the genius of control takes place. What happens in Egypt is what happens behind closed doors. The message that is sent in situations like this really is that nobody is immune from protection. I mean, essentially, everyone in Egypt is subject to some kind of accountability, but not from that of responsible journalism, but of political calculation.
Karim Amr knows that better than anyone. 10 days before the vote, the former blogger was freed after 4 years in jail for inciting sedition and insulting President Mubarak. The man who went to prison bears little resemblance to the man who came out.
I think the government was trying to use my case to instill fear in bloggers and activists, and I hope they don't achieve this. The message I'd like to send to the youth of Egypt, and in particular the bloggers and political activists who oppose the regime, the goal you want to achieve is near. The violence used by the government against you indicates the government is nearing its end. And I hope you never lose sight of what you want or be impacted by what has happened to me.
There is also a great deal of concern when people like Karim Amer and others are arrested and silenced. It does tend to send tremors across the blogosphere, but sometimes it also has a positive effect in that it galvanizes people even more.
The message to bloggers was shut up or else, except that hasn't prevented them from going ahead and blogging. I mean, the Egyptian blogosphere is still very active, very dynamic. They're making inroads, they're making a dent. Otherwise, why would the regime be so keen on trying to silence them?
In fact, on the eve of the vote, 16 political websites just disappeared. So bloggers, religious channels, private TV companies, text message services have all been shut down or restricted in the space of just 8 weeks. The presidential elections are 10 months away. At this rate, that election, one of the biggest stories in the Arab world, will be reported to Egyptians by friends of the Mubarak government or not reported at all. Our Global Village Voice is now on Egypt and the rules of the media game.
Covering these elections as a journalist was a surreal experience because we were basically participating in a mass theatrical production orchestrated by the Egyptian regime. The question then became, how can journalists cover this important political process without lending it any credibility as a democratic exercise?
Despite crackdowns by the Egyptian government and the largely silent state press, private media and Twitter were filled with reports from all over the country of closed polling stations, clashes between demonstrators and police, and widespread fraud.
In general, the media coverage of 2010 ballot was good. It was much better than the coverage available in 2005. The increasing number of internet users, the expansion of the blogosphere, and the improving levels of professionality of both journalists and activists were among the factors that led to this important development.
Our Global Village Voices platform is how our viewers let us know what they think of the global media and the way that news is covered. You can go to our Facebook or Twitter page to see what stories we're working on, to see how you can weigh in. You can also reach us through email. We're at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. We're devoting our entire News Bite section this week to one story and the media angles therein. Governments around the world, starting with the one in Washington, are still dealing with the aftershocks of the latest barrage of confidential documents released by WikiLeaks. The publication of hundreds of thousands of diplomatic cables had the media feasting on some tasty revelations made by American diplomats, and some of the material relates to major media companies. In Turkey, for instance, the Erdogan government is feuding with that country's biggest media conglomerate, the Doğan Yan Group, and the government has hit Doğan with a $1 billion fine for tax irregularities. According to a cable sent from the U.S. Embassy in Ankara in 2008, Government Minister Mehmet Şimşek was telling people to sell their stock in Doğan because the company, quote, won't be around much longer, unquote. Mr. Şimşek has denied saying that, but this story is being widely covered in Turkey. Al Jazeera came up in the cables. In a message to the U.S. State Department, Meir Dagan, the head of the Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad, warned that Al Jazeera, quote, may be the cause of the next war in the Middle East, unquote. And that, quote, some Arab leaders are willing to take draconian steps to close the channel and have the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, personally held responsible for the provocations, unquote. We're reporting that story here. It's also up on the channel's website. But much of the global media took a cautious approach to the WikiLeaks release, particularly with comments made about their own countries. Saudi Arabia's media, either state-run or state-controlled, ignored the allegation that in 2008 King Abdullah urged the U.S. to attack Iranian nuclear facilities. Saudi media focused instead on the question of the authenticity of the documents and the potential embarrassment the release caused for the U.S. The WikiLeaks release was definitely not big news in China, where the organization's site was blocked. The media there did report the wider Cablegate story, but only in the vaguest of terms, and stayed away from what the documents said about China's habit of censoring the internet and other dispatches about China's relationship with North Korea. There was some similar cherry-picking going on in the Russian media. They went with the story of how in 2008 the U.S. ambassador in Georgia blamed South Ossetia and not Russia for starting the war there, while staying away from American diplomats allegedly characterizing Prime Minister Putin as a, quote, alpha dog, unquote, and the ties that U.S. diplomats made between the Russian government and the mafia there. Meanwhile, U.S. Congressman Peter King was among many American politicians publicly outraged by the leaks. He called for WikiLeaks to be designated as a foreign terrorist organization. No word yet on whether Mr. King considers the news outlets who worked closely with WikiLeaks on this story to be terrorists as well. They include the New York Times, The Guardian in the UK, Der Spiegel in Germany, Le Monde in France, and El País in Spain. WikiLeaks' alliance with mainstream outlets makes sense because the organization says it is increasingly prone to cyber attacks and was targeted just prior to this latest release. WikiLeaks sidestepped that by hiring servers through Amazon, an American company, and storing its files there. A few days later, Amazon severed that relationship. WikiLeaks said it relocated its data to European servers and tweeted on the issue of freedom of speech, if Amazon are so uncomfortable with the First Amendment, they should get out of the business of selling books. This story is far from over, and we'll take a longer look at it on next week's program. We're back after the break with a piece on political memoirs, books that become multimedia events. Welcome back. Here's a question. How many of you out there have, in the past weeks and months, seen George W. Bush or Tony Blair on television talking about their recently published memoirs? Now, how many of you have actually read the books? The point of our next story is precisely that. These days, it's not about the book. The writing of a memoir provides an opportunity for ex-leaders to write their version of history, in some cases rewrite actual history. And the process also utilizes every form of media available, from daytime TV to Twitter, to amplify their core messages, to restore sometimes sullied reputations, and maybe even make out-of-power political parties electable once again. The Listening Post's Jason Mojica now on Bush, Blair, and the art of the memoir media blitz.
Now to a Today exclusive, a live conversation with George W. Bush. The former president's new memoir, Decision Points, is now out.
The prominence that memoirs have taken over the last decade or two is a striking phenomenon.
Tony Blair's long-awaited memoir was attracting lots of media attention in Britain as it hit the bookstores, and it was stirring some political passions as well.
You know, when he was first elected, there was talk that he tended to favor women's magazines and breakfast programs and kind of light media.
Some of the imagery, I'm not quite sure when you describe the relationship, it's a we were like lovers.
There's probably a small share of the public that actually read these books.
I want to do an interview that's a little bit different than the pinheads you've been talking to all week. So
George W. Bush can have a complete and thorough PR campaign and never go on the shows that will ask him the very tough questions.
Was it a difficult process for you writing this book?
A lot of people didn't think I could read, much less write.
Winston Churchill assured his World War II allies that history would judge them kindly, because he would write that history. And he did, 6 volumes worth. More than half a century later, George Bush and Tony Blair are taking a page from Churchill's book, trying to beat historians to the punch.
I think the point of any memoir first is for the subject, the author, to make sure they get their version of history into the history books. They know that people will be writing an account of their time in office, and they want to make sure they get their version in pretty early.
The modern-day political memoir is so much more than a book. It is a full-on public relations multimedia monster, and no matter where you try to hide, it will find you.
I take readers aboard Air Force One during my re-election campaign in 2004, inside the Oval Office for meetings with members of Congress.
The idea that you have former presidents out there hawking books on late-night cable shows and with daytime cable talk shows and network shows is a strange one.
But I have zero desire to be in the limelight except for this brief moment.
No, I understand.
When I'm willing to talk with my friend in order to sell books.
I got it.
While they're in office, politicians often have an adversarial relationship with the media, reporters who feel it is their duty to engage in combat with public officials. But when it's time to tell the tale of their political legacy, media become an important ally.
They have to get that media blitz right, because most people will only get that account of it. And you see the effort that goes into it, choosing, hand-picking the interviewer who will be with them, deciding what information is released first.
What's so fascinating about this book is that it's like being inside the president's head.
Well, I'm sure that his publicist told him you've got to do Oprah, because in the United States, if you go on Oprah, you're going to sell tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of books. She's got the Midas touch in the literary world.
Bush also did a 1-hour special with NBC's Matt Lauer, and it was clear who was running the show.
Let's talk about waterboarding.
Okay. A huge revelation was George Bush admitting that he personally authorized waterboarding.
He obviously feels like he has political immunity, and the fact that the media has essentially ignored that admission shows that he was right about that.
Michael Moore, whose film Fahrenheit 9/11 was famously hard on Bush, also thought Lauer's interview was too soft.
I will give them for free Fahrenheit 9/11 to run on NBC as balance to all this publicity that they've been giving President Bush this week.
Bush continued his PR blitz with not one.
Your approval rating is going up.
Imagine how high it's going to be after talking with you.
It's going to be through the roof.
Not 2, but 3 appearances on Fox News.
Is this your favorite place?
Yeah, we love it here.
When George W. Bush went on Sean Hannity, it was, sort of a charade. The tough questions that he asked was, how good were you? Really good or excellent?
For any Republican candidate or politician now, Fox News has become the safe space, a safe haven, the therapist's couch that is offered to them. In Britain, there's not really an equivalent of that.
If you show up on BBC Radio 4's flagship program, the Today program, it doesn't matter if you're a nun, a priest, the Prime Minister, you are going to get laid into by whoever is asking the questions.
Perhaps that's why when it was time for Blair to promote his book, he didn't spend much time in the UK.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
After one primetime interview with the BBC's Andrew Marr and an appearance on ITV's chummy morning show Daybreak, Blair fell into the welcoming arms of American media.
Did you think of leaving when you heard us?
Yeah, I just couldn't find the way out, really. It's quite a show.
They love him in the States. His style is very American. He's religious. He's polished. He's a hawk on military issues. He thinks Iraq is great. That was a fine thing to do.
The important thing is, if these people could have killed 30,000 or 300,000, they would have.
President Bush and Tony Blair were both fairly unapologetic about the decisions that they made that led to disaster.
Those decisions I made were necessary.
It's kind of a new PR strategy that go out and completely stand by an utterly unpopular decision and proclaim it a success.
Would you do it again?
No, as I've always said to people, I still believe it was the right decision.
The thinking is that if you keep saying it was a success, it worked, that eventually enough people will believe that that's true.
It's not just the authors who stand to gain from this revision of history.
I noticed that as soon as the Bush book appeared, a whole lot of key Republican personalities were, even on Twitter, were saying, you've got to go and buy this book, it's wonderful, it's great, even before they could possibly have read it. Now, why are they doing that? In the case of some of them, these are people who worked directly with Bush, and so their reputation depends on his reputation.
And so it seems that the memoirs of Bush and Blair are more than a profitable ego trip down memory lane. Together with their carefully constructed PR campaigns, they're as concerned with the future of the Republican and Labor parties as they are with the long view of history.
More Global Village Voices now on political memoirs and the media angle.
It may seem like George Bush has been on every single television channel talking about his book, but the channels themselves don't make that big a difference. CNN's a lot different than the Republican-friendly outlet Fox News, but a book like Bush's actually creates a specific kind of interview wherever it might appear. Maybe the most important thing it does is give Bush an out when the conversation gets testy, as it did when Matt Lauer pushed him on waterboarding on NBC. When Bush ran out of things to say, he played his best card. All I ask is that people read it in the book.
The memoirs of Tony Blair and George W. Bush present these world leaders with an opportunity to give their versions of history, a chance to explain and rationalize some of their more controversial decisions, especially the decision to go to war. But as with all human history, it is an exercise in subjectivity, because while we may fully understand what happened, we may never truly understand why it happened.
And finally, here at the Listening Post, we're always up for a good music track married with some slick animation. This video is called To the Beat. It was put together by a music label based in Germany called Desolat. Their animators show the journey taken by a piece of music as it gets transformed into a professionally produced track. The cityscape in the background is Dusseldorf. The beat is addictive, and we've made this our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at the Listening Post.